Hello, my name is Morgan Berg, and this is my older adult oral presentation over my interview I conducted with my grandmother. Alright, so for this assignment, during my interview, I saw a pattern in this part of the interview. We were talking about adolescence and early adulthood, and it seemed very enmeshed when we were talking about it because there was a lot of events during this time frame of age 13 to 18. So for these stages, I really want to talk about the identity versus identity confusion and intimacy versus isolation. For identity versus identity confusion, adolescents are developing a sense of identity and figuring out the roles they play within their family and their community. Intimacy versus isolation, young adults are looking for intimacy and closeness in their relationships. Alright, so for this interview, I did see a pattern of, not a pattern, but these two stages being a mesh. So I wanted to look into some research that shows that these developmental stages can be a mesh. So I found this one that talked about identity issues and identity formation being a recurring role in all developmental stages, not just adolescence. So this shows that it is possible that different tasks from different stages can be shown in different developmental stages. But this particular study, it did show that revisiting these identity issues may affect their effort to maintain stability in their intimate partnerships and well-being. Although I did not find this to be the case with my grandmother, she did have positive intimate relationships with friends and family, and her sense of well-being seemed to be pretty high as well. Alright, so during the interview, we looked into adolescence and early adulthood. There were a lot of changes that impacted her development. So she lost her father at the age of 13. This really affected her. She was there. So it went from a family of 3 to a family of 2, and her mother was not dealing with it very well, so she was taking care of her mother during this time. So there was a shift in dynamic there between a parent and child, and then fast forwarding a couple years later, her mother did remarry, so it changed the dynamic again. Even though she did have fond memories with her stepfather, it did affect her developmentally, having another person partaking in her life. And then at the age of 18, my grandmother found out she was pregnant at her last semester of high school. She had to not attend in person, and then she was soon married. She was able to obtain a high school diploma. I did talk about the challenges earlier. She lost her father, pregnancy, and the family dynamic shifted. She was 3 with her and her mother, and then 2 with just her and her mother, and then her and her mother and her stepfather, and then she created her own family dynamic with her husband and her baby. But she did have a lot of accomplishments in her adolescence to early adulthood stages. She was very active in school activities. She was president of a lot of her groups that she participated in. She was accepted into college, but then when she found out she was pregnant, she did not go to college. But she did say that becoming a mother was a very good alternative. But I really wanted to shift and talk about ego-dystonic and syntonic, just because it does look further more into the formation of self-identity. And so syntonic is accepted on a conscious developmental achievement, and dystonic is overcoming symptoms of failure. She did discuss that when she was pregnant, she couldn't go to college anymore, so she felt like she did have a failure, but she shifted it. She's like, I'm becoming a mother, and she turn that into a positive scenario. And so she overcomes her failure by looking into something else as a positive. All right, so for the resolution, grief, she was grieving her loss of her father and the changes in her dynamic. I really looked into different researches and looked at self-regulation really helped with grieving and going through crisis. So just a little bit more. So there's 3 self-regulation. There's attentional control, activation control, and inhibitory control. Attentional control is the ability to focus attention as well as shift attention when desired. Activation control is the ability to perform an action when there is a strong impulse to avoid it. Inhibitory control is the ability to suppress inappropriate responses. And for this, my grandmother did show a lot of attentional control as she was shifting her focus into more positive outlets, such as participating in activities and especially looking at not going to college and instead being a mother, looking at that role as a mother as a positive and as a positive thing. All right, so my grandmother did show a lot of resilience when dealing with the loss of her father. And I just wanted to define resilience. Resilience refers to psychological processes which enables an individual to cope and recover with life stressors. All right, so just a little bit more background about my grandmother. She is a white woman that grew up in rural uh, northern Illinois, which is very close to Wisconsin. And just to give you more of a outlook on what that community is like, in her county, there's roughly about 13,000 people living there. Um, she is a Lutheran. She wasn't always a Lutheran. When she was younger, her family did not go to church. Her mother was a Methodist, and her father was a Southern Baptist. She didn't become a Lutheran until after her father died when she was 13. She actually went with her neighbors, and that's where she found her outlet in religion, and she actually has positive associations. She said that going to church, she felt like God was her other father since her father was deceased. When she was younger, when her dad was alive, she was considered to be in middle class. When her father died, they did struggle financially. Her mother had a gated job as a secretary, and it would have been considered lower middle class. High school education, she did obtain a high school education. All right, so going back to my other slide here, a positive resolution here, she does have a very good thing, a positive attribute with her faith, saying as a coping mechanism, especially after her father died. She obtained a positive support system. When her father died, they moved back around family, so she was able to be around family and have a support system with her neighbors, and also through the activities she partaked in school. Some negative things, negative resolutions. She'd play other roles, like she had to take care of her mother when her mother was grieving, and then also just losing the impact of losing her father, and then shortly gaining a stepfather. And also during this time when he was low and they were struggling financially. All right, so looking at the systems, micro, meso, and macro, there were a lot of changes in her microsystem from her dad dying. So there was 3 people in the family, and then there was 2, and then 3 again with her mother marrying her stepfather, and then shortly after her creating her own family dynamic with my grandfather and their child. And then going on to mesosystems, she was very active in her school. She was president in a lot of her activities, and then also she was very active in her church as well. And then in the macro system, there was a lot of cultural norms that partaked in this in their community, since it was a very conservative community. So women weren't necessarily able to work other jobs besides being a teacher and a secretary. So my grandmother's mother decided to was working as a secretary after my great grandfather died. And then also, it is a woman's expectation to stay at home and be a mother. So that's why my grandmother, she had an obligation to marry my grandfather when she became pregnant. All right, so the other theory I chose to discuss is the social learning theory, which suggests that people are active agents in their own learning and they're interacting with their own surroundings. We saw this when I was interviewing my grandmother. I did see a common pattern here. How she talked about learning different things such as religion. She was very much so there to learn and take in all the information she could. So her self-efficacy level is very high and where she can perform tasks successfully. All right, so there's some theory of limitations here. So with the Erikson's theory of development, I kind of talked about it at the beginning of this presentation about how there was an emphasis, enmeshed quality in some of the stages, and particularly the identity versus identity confusion and intimacy versus isolation. So the emphasis on stages may not work for everyone, but I do feel like it is a good stepping stone. And then also the stages, this theory is very difficult to test and measure. So if you were wanting to measure this in a study, it would be difficult to do so. And also this theory lacks relevance in socioeconomic, ethnic, and other minority differences. It fails to address those factors. And then with the social learning theory, it just automatically assumes that people change when their environment changes, and that's not necessarily the case with everyone, especially when people travel. You're still yourself, but your environment is different. Oh, so thank you for listening to my presentation. And here are a list of my references. So thank you very much.